morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Let me introduce Dr. Bryan Meadows. Dr. Meadows is Associate Professor and Director of Teacher Education Programs at Fairleigh Dickinson University. But before, he was also part of faculty at University of Texas and Texas Rio Grande Valley. His main area of research is the relationship between nationalism and linguistic education, but he has also other research interests like teacher education, intercultural education, applied linguistics, critical discourse analysis, and systemic functional linguistics. His research can be found in different national, Colombian, and international journals. So let me give you Dr. Bryan Meadows. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Guerrero, for the wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for sharing your time with me this morning and allowing me to share some thoughts about nationalism and ELT and critical pedagogy. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to work with you, and I'm grateful to the Doctorado Interinstitucional in Educación for inviting me here and for treating me so well and making me feel so welcome. And thank you also for your patience as we're working through the technical issues, and my thanks to the fantastic university staff for addressing the issue. So I will begin. I'll be relying a lot on my notes this morning, so please allow me that privilege. The title of my talk is Nationalism and ELT, Some Challenges for Critical Pedagogy. Many of us are involved in critical pedagogy. Many of us are looking to infuse, to bring critical pedagogy into our language teaching. There are some roadblocks, however. There are some challenges presented by nationalism. So I'd like to present some ideas and some insights into the roots of these problems that are found in nationalism. And I'll begin with a very short clip that I believe demonstrates the challenges that nationalism poses for us. And you may know this person very well. You may have seen him before. This is the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, and he spoke maybe last week or 2 weeks ago about this new policy for immigration, for rules and regulations for bringing new people into the United States. I'm going to play a very short clip because I think it has something important to say about nationalism and language.
U.S. workers and taxpayers, and that is why we are here today, merit-based. The RAISE Act, R-A-I-S-E, the RAISE Act will reduce poverty, increase wages, and save taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. It will do this by changing the way the United States issues green cards to nationals from other countries. Green cards provide permanent residency, work authorization, and fast track to citizenship. For decades, the United States was operated and has operated a very low-skilled immigration system, issuing record numbers of green cards to low-wage immigrants. This policy has placed substantial pressure on American workers, taxpayers, and community resources. Among those hit the hardest in recent years have been immigrants, and very importantly, minority workers competing for jobs against brand new arrivals. And it has not been fair to our people, to our citizens, to our workers. The RAISE Act ends chain migration and replaces our low-skilled system with a new points-based system for receiving a green card. This competitive application process will favor applicants who can speak English, financially support themselves and their families, and demonstrate skills that will contribute to our economy.
Okay, so I'll stop there. Right, so what I'd like to highlight from this brief statement was the statement that people coming into the United States must speak English. So that's really an illustration of what I'd like to talk about today, is this marriage, this connection between the idea of the nation, this national space, and then this one particular kind of language. In this case, the politician is arguing that the United States, that space, should be an English-only space. So what are the roots of that? I would like to share with you today as best I can the argument and the justification, the logic that comes from nationalism, and then which then influences our own English teaching. So this is really my point today, is we become complicit in this kind of national project, which leads to excluding certain people from the national space based on language, and that I believe there's a new model that we need for English teaching based on something different. We can't rely on the nation exclusively. We need to think about English language teaching based on a new model that where transnationalism is at the center, translanguaging is at the center, not monolingualism, not monoculturalism, and not very clear, discrete national borders. So the overview of my talk today is to share some basic design of nationalism as an ideology here. What are the principles, what are the arguments behind nationalism? And then we'll talk about the specific role of language in nationalism. Language plays an important role in the national project. How is nationalism used to justify exclusionary practices in society? And how is ELT, English language teaching, how does it become complicit? Some challenges posed by the Herderian principle. This is one language, one nation. Some critical responses that are ongoing. And then conclusions, there's always space for hope. Critical pedagogy is about liberation, also about hope. And we'll talk about hope at the very end. Right, so I'll move over this way now. A few initial ideas about nationalism. It's been defined since the 1990s as an ideology that was offered by Michael Billig. He writes the following: nationalism and ideology, it's a pattern of belief and practice which reproduce the world, our world, as a series of nation-states in which we live as citizens of nation-states. In other words, it's the idea that human society, the globe, can be easily or properly categorized into individual nations, and then each nation is controlled by a political state that reflects that nation. Therefore, we have nation-states. So this is an ideology that is not timeless. It came out of a particular place, it came out of a particular subjectivity. Some basic arguments to nationalism as an ideology. This is following Kaduri, 1993. He establishes the idea that humanity can be divided into nations. Second is that each nation should have a unique character. Each nation has a unique national essence that's different from all others. So this is the principle of diversity, that nationalism encourages individuals to find the national essence and to identify it. And that nation is different from all others. So the principle of diversity is very important. Next is the principle of sovereignty, that in order to find the national essence, to protect the national character, we need a political state that reflects the national character at the same time. Therefore, you have a nation state. So the legitimacy of the political state only comes from the national people. If they reflect the national people, then they're a legitimate political state. However, if they do not reflect the national people, then they're not a legitimate political state. So goes the argument for nationalism. Today, this seems very obvious for us, because nationalism has become so pervasive, and it's an everyday common sense understanding for us now, but it was not always like that. This is a recent development in the last 200 or 300 years. So the sovereignty principle, diversity, and then finally the notion that nations never exist alone. So of course, if you identify yourself, you're identifying the other at the same time. So nations do not exist alone. They exist in this international network of nations. And each nation state is recognizing and respecting the space of their neighboring nation states. So it creates this network of compartments, of nation state compartments. So there's social scientific analysis of nationalism. So social scientists are analyzing nationalism for at least 30 to 40 years at this point. This is known as nationalism studies. A few ways that they understand nations. One is the idea that nationalism, the ideology, creates nations. We only have nations, we only have the national unit because of the ideology underneath it. If there's no ideology, then we don't have nations. Second, that people in real life situations, they draw on this ideology, they draw on these principles, like our good friend, the United States President, he draws on these principles in order to realize and define and identify the nation in real life settings. Therefore, context is very important. So what counts as one nation in one situation may not count in another situation. It depends on who is talking to whom, where we're talking, what happened before, the power relations in the situation. And based on those power relations, then the nation takes different forms. In other words, there's no external objective nation that exists outside of us. The nation is always realized in our conversation. Therefore, social scientists are looking at the discourse. How do people talk to one another? To defend, to challenge, to realize, also to change and transform the nation. Right. And then Calhoun, I think, makes this point very clearly in 1997. He writes, "The point is not that such categorical identities or national identities are not real, any more than that nations are not real. It is rather that they are not fixed." So nations are not fixed, national identity is not fixed, but it's fluid and it's malleable. We can change it. It's dynamic. It depends on the situation. Cultural and physical differences, of course, exist, but their discreteness, the borders, are created and negotiated and defined in our conversations. So nationalism gives us the borders that we use to define this very diverse landscape. So according to social scientists, according to nationalism studies, we should be talking about each nation in the plural. So we should be talking about not the Japanese nation, but Japanese nations. And talking about, let me see, what else? Kenya, for example, not Kenya nation, but Kenya nations, because there are multiple possibilities. It's always changing according to the context. There are three key ideas in nationalism studies that define the landscape. One is imagined communities. This was Benedict Anderson in 1983. Defined nations as an imagined community, the first time in history that humans were able to imagine people beyond them, and that those people beyond them are comrades or share a relationship. The imagined communities. Second is banal nationalism. Banal, the idea that nationalism is in the everyday, and just like many ideologies, it pervades our common sense so that we don't really notice it. And his metaphor is the flag that's hanging in the window, that often in our everyday lives, we see national flags around us all the time, and they become ubiquitous, they become in the background, and they become common sense to us. So Billig's idea is that that's how we reproduce nationalism. It's obvious because we're reminded of the nation all around us. And I'm sorry I don't have pictures, but you can imagine. I've been fortunate to be in the country for about 4 or 5 days now, and I've seen many instances around the cities and around the freeways and the streets, seeing examples of the Colombian flag, for example. Also, invented traditions is Hobsbawm and Rogers in 1983. They explain that nations rely on invented traditions. And an easy example are national holidays. So in my experience in the United States, there's a Thanksgiving holiday is a national holiday in late November. And there's this narrative that was developed that was the beginning of the nation in the 1600s, when the European pilgrims sat down with the indigenous nations and then had dinner together. However, that story, that narrative, developed in the 1800s, much, much later. So Hobsbawm and Rogers argue that those invented traditions, those invented permanencies, are essential to nations, that we tell ourselves these narratives all the time. Yes, so that's about the scientific analysis of nationalism. As I mentioned earlier, that nationalism as an ideology is not timeless. It did not exist thousands of years ago. It emerged out of one particular historical context. Can you imagine around what time period it emerged? Can you guess? It's fairly recent. The Second World War? The scholars put it a little bit further back in the past. Where? Modernism, yes, modernism, but around what year, though, would you say? 1700s? 1700? Yeah, right. Later 1700s, right? It came out of Western Europe. It came out of the writing of the Romantics. And they were philosophers, they were scholars, also artists as well. And they were looking for a better way of living. And they felt that there was a problem with the current political systems. At that time, there were monarchies. So there was a king or a queen who would rule over their subjects. But that king or queen did not identify with the subjects necessarily. They didn't share a close identity. So there were monarchies, but then also empires as well. And in the empires you had one central organization, political state, which then ruled all of these individual nations. So the political state did not represent the people as they defined themselves. So the Romanticists argued that we needed something different, a new kind of political system that represents us as a nation. So two very influential philosophers are Herder and Fichte. And I have pictures of them because visuals always help. That's not it. Here they are. This is Herder. And then this is Fichte. Here. And they were arguing for a German nation, and they did it in their writings. They discovered the German nation, discovered the German language. But from a social scientific point of view, they were creating it. What they claimed that they were discovering, they were actually creating it in their own writings. But also we should recognize too that nationalism was extremely radical at that time. It was politically dangerous for those in power, because really, authors like this, they're arguing that the political state has no legitimacy over us, that the only legitimacy comes from us as the national people. Therefore, they campaign for a nation state. Great. Good. All right. So there's some historical basis of nationalism. And as I mentioned earlier, that nationalism has a special affinity, a special connection to language. For writers like Herder, where's my friend? Herder. For writers like Herder, the national language is the only way to find national expression. So the only way to be true to oneself as a national subject is to use the national language. It's the only pathway. And this is called the one language, one nation principle, also known as Herderian principle. And he was the most influential advocate of this stance. So he wrote, for example, according to Keduri, he wrote, this is Herder speaking, "It follows this, that the member of one nation must not take up the customs or the language of another nation." So we have to keep it separate. One language, one nation. "Such a man forsakes or gives up the spontaneous and the genuine and embraces the contrived and the artificial. He thus impoverishes his nation and hinders the assertion of his individuality." So if you give up your national language, you are somehow diminishing the nation, you're tainting the nation, you're maybe mixing it with something else, and therefore hurting its diversity, hurting its individuality, its uniqueness. So this is known as the Herderian principle, and it is pervasive, as you know, in our everyday lives, also in political speeches. in our own folk ideologies that we carry with us, but also I'll argue in English language teaching. In English language teaching, we rely a lot on the Herderian principle. Yes, so there are consequences for the Herderian principle that I'd like to share very briefly. One is that national language becomes your primary claim for nationhood. If you've seen this through history, if a group wants to establish themselves as a nation, often they have to argue that we have our own national language. So therefore you have political struggles over what is dialect and what is its own language. Also you have arguments over the words like Creole, for example, and then its own legitimate language. Because often defining a legitimate language means a legitimate nation at the same time. State institutions, of course, will promote the national language in various institutions. And therefore, the national language becomes an important pathway for participating in the various institutions. So I'm thinking of the legal system, I'm thinking of the political system, and of course the educational system for us. And the national language is imbued with a symbolic capital. So in order to speak with legitimacy, with public voice in a political institution, for example, or maybe an educational institution, often you must master a particular form of the national language. So I'd like to share with you a brief example of this. It's a little bit disturbing to watch, but we'll stay focused on just the ideology. Where is the argument coming from? And this is an example that came from the Texas State Legislature. It's been about 5 years at this point. But there was a man from the public, and he's speaking to the senators about a law that was being considered. The senators in Texas were considering a law that would allow the police officers more power to enforce immigration law. And one person came to speak against that proposal. And then some disturbing things happening, but the argument that's coming from the politician is a Herderian principle. It's a nationalist argument is what they're making.
Hi, well, mi nombre es Antolín Aguirre y represento a la coalición por los derechos de los inmigrantes en Austin.
My name is Antonio Aguirre and I represent the Austin Immigrants' Rights Coalition.
Y estamos totalmente en desacuerdo con la propuesta SB9 que afecta a todas nuestras familias y a todas nuestras comunidades.
And we are 100% opposed to SB9, which impacts our families and our communities.
Una de las cosas que me impresionó en este país cuando yo vine en el 88,
one of the things that impressed me when I came to this country in 1988,
es que esta nación decía, confiamos en...
For every action, there are many implications and unintended consequences.
Did I understand him correctly that he has been here since 1988?
He came to this country in 1988.
Yes, sir, it's correct.
Why aren't you speaking in English then?
Well,
Years.
I speak English, but
You've been here for 23 years.
I have around 20 years. Well, okay. Sí, lo que pasa es que yo sé el idioma, pero prefiero, como es mi primera vez, prefiero hacerlo con un traductor.
Spanish is his first language, and since it's his first time giving a testimony, he would rather do it in
It's
Spanish.
insulting to us.
Thank you.
It's very insulting. And if he knows English, he needs to be speaking in English.
If I could get everybody's attention, just everybody.
Okay. All right. Very disturbing. Right. So where is this argument coming from? This senator who's saying this is very insulting. If you're in the United States, you must speak English. This is coming from the Herderian principle. This is rooted in nationalism. Right, this is a nationalized space, this is somehow America, and therefore English only in this space. So it's not mutual intelligibility. The senator understood everything that the person was, his testimony, everything of course. But in his mind, it was breaking this Herderian principle, and therefore was insulting, was illegitimate. So as I hope I'm showing through this example and also our good friend previously, the US President, that nationalism does become justification for exclusionary practices in society. This can be traced back to the principle of diversity, the idea that every nation has to have these clear borders. So nationalism works best when you have categorical distinctions. You have very clear distinctions between A and B, and nothing in between. So these categorical distinctions, of course, as an ideology, they work as fractals, meaning that we have this distinction. This is nation A, this is nation B, and schooling. And then this is nation A, and this is nation B, and food, for example. And this is nation A, and this is nation B, and maybe the legal system. And then this is nation A, and this is nation B, and maybe gender as well. So as you create these distinctions and you reproduce them in many different places, then for us they become obvious, they become common sense, and we don't require justification anymore. However, humanity is not really like that, as we know. There's a lot of diversity around us, there's a lot of variation within these national spaces. But then across national spaces, there's a lot of contiguity, a lot of similarity and connections as well. So what does nationalism do in response? The diversity principle means that you have to delegitimize, you have to diminish, you have to erase, you have to subordinate anything that doesn't fit within these boundaries. So that's going to mean restriction for access to many resources in society. We have symbolic resources, of course, capital, but you also have access to education, access to the legal system, access to employment. For those who do not fit on this boundary, inside this nation or on that nation, if someone fits in the middle here, then nationalism provides justification to marginalize and oppress that person. And Calhoun explains this in 1997. As categorical identities, nations help answer the question of who is entitled to participate in a modern state. To resist the heterodox claims, so the heterogeneous claims of various individuals and groups within the nation, those who would remake it or ask of it space to live differently from the ways authorized in dominant nationalist ideologies, those are the ones who are going to be marginalized, erased, subjugated. So then, as people pick up these distinctions, this is nation A, this is nation B, then of course that goes into other areas, such as our area, ELT, English Language Teaching. We also rely on these clear distinctions between this language, that national culture, this national culture, for example. And according to Riesager, we're actually involved in a national paradigm, meaning that language teaching depends on the national unit exclusively to define what we do, to define what we study, to define student success. It's defined if they emulate this particular national language or emulate this particular national culture, but nothing in between. So often we teach, might teach the French language that's spoken by the French nation, for example, but we often, English language teaching, right? So English language teaching, we teach the English of this nation or that nation, but we may not teach the English of sports athletes. We may not teach the English of young kids now are playing games on the internet and they're interconnected with one another using English, so we're not studying that. Often, language teaching is connected to some national unit. So what does end up happening is language teaching, we become complicit in these marginalizing practices. So the distinctions that are made outside of the classroom, we bring those into our own classroom and then legitimize those and justify them, and therefore perpetuate them. Right, so 3 examples of how we do this. One is defining the nation in the singular. When we present nations to our students, we often talk about one nation, Canada, or the Argentina, or the United States, right? Instead of thinking about plural. That's related to sovereignty. If we just speak about one nation state, then we're legitimizing their claim to the people, the communities that are inside. We also teach standard varieties of language that are approved by the nation states. Sovereignty, again, therefore legitimizing and justifying their own claims. And then finally, we very often underscore differences in our classes. This is how people in this nation talk. This is how people in this nation talk. This is how people in this nation be polite, etiquette, talk to one another. This is how people in this nation do it. So we're supporting diversity principle. We're not looking for instances of connecting the national communities. And this is called the fetishization of the other. We spend too much time talking about cultural differences and linguistic differences. So the Herderian principle, the more we rely on it, we develop a monolingual model for our own teaching. This is, I think, contradictory at a fundamental level for language teaching, because the diversity principle says you do not break borders, but you stay within this border. You might go to that border, but you don't break the border or challenge it. However, language teaching is all about border crossing. We're developing transnational, we're developing trans-language individuals, developing trans-cultural individuals. So in many cases, if we depend on monolingualism, monoculturalism, we're creating students who step over these boundaries without taking agency for defining the boundary for themselves, which they'll need to do as transnational individuals. And I think we can all agree, as you study a language, it changes who you are forever. You're not the same as you were before you started studying the language and participating in these new communities. So for example, bilingualism often is seen, in my experience, has been seen as acceptable as long as you don't break the borders. So we can speak language A now, but we can speak language B later, but we can't speak both at the same time. Code mixing can be seen as deficient language practice, for example. So that's based on a monolingual model, which is traced back to Herderian principle, one nation, one language. Also, when we think in monolingual terms, we're limiting the pathways for our students. In order for you to be successful, you have to become just like people in this national space, which limits their own legitimacy. Because we should instead encourage them to find legitimacy as transnational individuals. L2 user was the term we were using yesterday. And also our representations. What we end up doing is we territorialize the language. So if we're going to study English, this is where people study English in these particular nations. The idea that language borders and national borders always coincide. And we represent that in our classroom, in our materials, the kinds of communities that we imagine for our students. Often it's territorialized. When you speak English, you'll have to go to this nation to speak that English. If you speak Japanese, you have to go to this place to speak Japanese. But in reality, the world is much more complex than that and much more interconnected. Yes, that's what I want to say. Right. Okay. All right. The third thing I want to say about the Herderian principle and how we become complicit in our own ELT practice is the influence on student perceptions and teacher perceptions and also marketing. And I wanted to share with you one case study from my own dissertation 8 years ago now. I was able to publish this in 2014, but I was looking at an adult English language classroom in Mexico. And the classroom was operated, it was maintained by a university in the United States. And the university would send teachers into Mexico 2 nights a week to teach the classes to students in Mexico. They were adult professionals, often involved in mid-level management. So they were looking for English for their employment. And my analysis, after spending about 15 weeks in the classroom and interviewing the students, observing and videotaping some of the classes, talking with the teacher also, one finding was what I called nationalist border practices. The idea that this situation reinforces clear borders, these categorical distinctions, one language, one nation. So for example, the marketing of the program. the university was very proud of the fact that they were sending authentic, real native speakers, Americans, to Mexico to teach real, authentic, native English. This was an important marketing point for them, and the students accepted this. The students in this classroom said that that was part of the reason why they chose this classroom, because it could create this immersion environment where they can interact with real Americanos was the word that they used. And then also the teacher as well reproduced the Herderian principle, these borders between nations. So often in his discussion, which is a legitimate pedagogical strategy, but he was trying to pull English from the students, so he would always ask for differences between Mexico and the United States. So in the United States we do this, how do you do this in Mexico, for example? So there's always this border going back and forth between the United States and then Mexico. From the students' perspective also, it was really entertaining to see this, but the students also look for chances to position the teacher as the American other. So sometimes you'll hear inside jokes among the students, often of a political nature, that would then leave out the teacher because they're making jokes about Mexican politics, for example, or Mexican celebrities. But then they for whatever reason, they didn't explain it to the teacher, so the teacher was kind of left out as the national other. You're not one of us. You're the American who doesn't understand our humor. And they would continue on with class. So this border practice seemed to work well for that particular context. I think no one was complaining. But I think from my perspective, we can also think on the long term, if we're engaging in teaching practices that are always reinforcing these borders, are we not also reinforcing and justifying these exclusionary practices that are going on in society defined by nationalism? So is there not some bigger picture here that we can think about? Yeah, so, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the classroom. I wish I could share with you. So let's think about where we can go with this. So I've made this argument. I've prosecuted ELT as complicit, as involved in these ongoing exclusionary practices. Nationalism, this Herderian principle, is often at the root, not always, but often at the root of what we're doing. So how can we go forward with this? What can critical pedagogy do? Here are some ideas. One is we cannot wish away nationalism. We can't just imagine that it's gone all of a sudden, that there are no nations. Nations are very real for us, for the students, for the teachers, for our institutions, so we can't just wish them away. However, I think what we can do is put the nation in context, put these ideologies in context, and try our best to suppress or to minimize the harmful practices that they justify, to provide alternative ways of thinking. We can do that in our classrooms. We can do that also in teacher education and how we develop our language teachers. Some things you can do individually. One is to learn about nationalism, to learn about the ideology, to learn about these principles, which hopefully I've done my very best to provide some initial ideas, but there is a lot more to it. So once we become more informed, then we can help our students become more informed. In the classroom, you might think about changing the discourse from exclusive to inclusive. So you're talking about nations, talking about national languages, always in the plural. So we're not studying English, but English is, for example, we're not studying how, we're not studying, I don't know, Chinese nations, or one Chinese nation, we're studying Chinese nations, all the different possibilities that are available. So we're trying to bring in as much as possible all of the possibilities. Be careful of the generalizations, is to try to qualify them in some way if you're talking about the national level. I become very concerned when I hear Brazilian people are this way, or Polish people are this way. I think we can make those statements as long as we qualify them. We can say, for example, based on my experience spending 2 or 3 days in Rio de Janeiro and working with people in a service encounter, I developed this impression of the Brazilian people that I talked to. That's one way you can do it. Or you can bring it down from the national level. You can say the people I met in Rio de Janeiro, for example. This was the impression that I received. And you can always look for exceptions. That's always a fun activity that I like to do. So we talk about Bolivian people are this way, except when they're not. And then we look for examples of when Bolivian people may not. So I hear very often that Canadian people are always polite. Well, except when they're not. And then with students, we can look at when are Canadian people not polite. So those are things we can do in the classroom to change the discourse a little bit. Also, we should be very deliberate in our representations of nations, to look for as many possible, to legitimize many different varieties of national expression, beyond just the textbook, beyond just the stereotypes, the symbols that we're familiar with. Also, attitude is something to always promote, our own attitude, to be willing to think about the social construction of these nations and its legitimacy, and especially the attitude of students, to often accept, in some cases, to accept that maybe that their own legitimacy is socially constructed as well, if it comes through the nation. So attitude is something that we can pay attention to. And then there are two persistent challenges that wake me up in the middle of the night, and things that I'm always concerned about. One is we as language teachers, so national authority, national legitimacy is also tied to different things. Race, for example, class, gender, sexual orientation, all these other things. But we are language teachers. So what is the limit of what we can do as language teachers? Do we have a responsibility to also engage with racist discourses, also with sexist discourses as well? So that's one thing that's a persistent challenge, is how far does our responsibility stretch? And the second is the need for a new ELT model, which I suggested at the beginning. I think right now, I believe, Resager, that we're in a national paradigm, that we're depending on nationalism to define what we're doing. But we have to continue thinking about what will our practice look like if we take transnationalism as the center, the transcultural individual as the center, as the goal, as the multilingual, the multicultural individual. If that's our goal, how does that change everything that we're doing outside of it? I think we still have, we're making progress, but I think we still have some work to do as scholars and also as educators. And I will close, look at the time. And I'll close with some reasons for hope. There's always space for hope. This is, where is it? This is a very brief speech provided by a liberal minister in Canada recently. Maybe this was last month, I think. And he's a liberal minister from Quebec, and he provided the following announcement or address to the Parliament, to the House of Commons. And this is his address, and I'll share the video shortly. But he says, today, for the beginning of Aboriginal History Month, I spoke to the House in Kanien'keha, the language of the Mohawk people on whose traditional land my writing is situated. It is a result of a personal journey to learn a new language and to raise awareness of Indigenous languages in Canada. It started out while I was in Quebec, caucus chair challenging my colleagues to perfect their French, So I decided to take on a new language as well. I hope to have inspired a few people to learn an Indigenous language. I'm sharing this with you because he presented this in the Mohawk language, the first time ever in the history of the nation state. In Canada, Standard French and Standard English are legitimized, but Mohawk up until this point has not. But this was a very important performance to demand this legitimate space for, up until this point, a marginalized language. So would you like to hear the video? Where is he? There he is.
Neganyangea. Ayawans ti ayon kwayatakena. Sa ayon watoron serioste. Ayawans oni ti ezo saa yogade. Ayobutunde neganyangea negantu. Tanu saa nihati korahrono ahontoriwa seseke. Ahonste tauntakarase. Wakonwelado ize sarenusastonista.
So through this act, this minister has created legitimate space, has demanded, claimed legitimate space for the Mohawk language, which until that point was marginalized. And speaking of hope, I would love for this minister to talk with the senator in Texas who was extremely insulted by the language practice, the person testifying. There are also other instances of hope. I found out recently that there's a Quechua language news service in Peru. They have a Facebook page and you can watch the videos. And maybe you also know other examples of nation states expanding the legitimacy for the languages and challenging this Herderian categorical distinction of one language, one nation. So I believe there's hope, and I think we play an important role as English educators, as language teachers, to continue this kind of social action. And we take that social action, first of all, in our own classrooms. And I'd like to conclude by saying that I'm, again, so thankful for this opportunity to speak with you. I'm so grateful for the invitation. And I'm also extremely hopeful for the DIE program because it is rooted in critical pedagogy. And I anticipate continued action in the field of English language teaching with the guidance of our program. And I'm so happy to have this association with the program. I'm so honored. And thank you very much for listening. And we started late, but maybe there's time for question and answer or dialogue. I'd love to hear your feedback, your ideas.
Questions?
In any language, because this is not the Herderian space. Right? Every language is welcome.
I have a question, and that concept you were talking about nation and nations, singular and plural.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what the implications of this or the differences between, say, nation and nations?
Right, excellent question. So what does that really look like in practice to you? So it would mean if you're talking with students, if you're representing to students a national space, instead of presenting just one national space as somehow self-evident or in an unproblematic way, there's only one legitimate national space, then you may also look for multiple representations of that same space, multiple possibilities. So I'm thinking of different, think of holidays. Holidays is a common thing in language classes. And for my experience with talking about the United States, they are the typical holidays that are familiar to me, at least. There's Christmas, and then there's Thanksgiving, and then it's July 4th, and they have these typical holidays that I think narrowly define the American nation, that these are only legitimate representations. However, those holidays themselves mean different things to different people. So if you're identified with Native nations, the idea of Thanksgiving can be really difficult. And why is that perception of Thanksgiving, why is that somehow illegitimate? Why is that erased? Why are we not talking about that in the classroom? You also have individuals who are legitimately represent the American nations, right? But they may not be Christian. So where is Hanukkah, for example? Or where is the Muslim holiday of Eid? You know, where are those represented in our teaching practices? And why are those not American as well? So I think that's what I mean by American nations, is that there are legitimate set of holidays for this expression of America or the United States. And here are some other holidays that are associated with another expression of the United States, and here are additional holidays, with the idea of legitimizing all of them, that they're all legitimate expressions of the nation. It's a lot of work, right? It's a lot, and it becomes multiple, so it's difficult to, it may not be in the student's best interest long term to provide very simple representations that everything's in multiple. It also encourages students to do their own research projects, so they become involved in their own content.
But I think it's very interesting and challenging because I don't listen to the commercial radio stations. I just listen to the Radio Nacional, and they have these chronicles. And today was about the Amazon, and there were so many things that I personally didn't know about the Amazon. So I think it is challenging and enriching to even within the same nation, quote nation. There are so many nations that we in the country, in the central country that is portrayed in the media, don't know.
Exactly.
So that idea is not that's not only applying to ELT but also to all for us as teachers, the educational system, and as citizens.
Yes.
To understand that there are all these nations, that is not only whatever we think we are in Bogotá or in Cali, the big cities, but there is more. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful point. I can add to that too. I think also you remind me of the fact that there are limitations to us as teachers. We can only really represent and teach what we really know from our own subjectivity, right? So that's why a diverse faculty is essential. That's why program directors, when they're hiring faculty, they need to think about the range of subjectivities that they're bringing into their program. The students as well may request and desire different kinds of teachers who represent different perspectives and different subjectivities, instead of always looking for this one authentic, real American, right? So students also have to look for diversity in the faculty. Because, right, if we're honest, there are only so many things I can represent faithfully and honestly to my students. I'm limited. And I'm so glad you raised that point, that there's so many other things going on, even though I might identify as American United States, or even though I might be legitimized as American United States, there's so much I'm unaware of. And there's so much I'm ignorant to at the same time. Yes? Thank you so much.
Maybe, I don't know, you mentioned something about nationalism, but it's good that you do this research, because it's helped that it's with the relation with happening as part of all Latin America, because the multiculturalism is another word that can be listed in this study, because it's all the people have the same age and have the same pronunciation.
Yes.
And it's our fair, yes.
Yes.
To be the rock, sure, I don't know this expression. Ser la roca en el zapato. Sí.
So we're part of the problem?
Sun in the shoes, yes. Because it's to have in the I think this discourse that Trump is outside of many linguistic things. I don't know.
Many things.
Have many things that is now represented in this, and we as teachers have to have this because now I don't know, it's the responsibility to have this kind of education and to thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the positive comments. And yes, I agree that with you that we have an important role to become the rock in the shoe, to resist these kinds of practices that let's say you are part of the nation, but you are not, right? So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Meadows, for being with us, for sharing these very interesting insights and food for thought, as one of my colleagues calls it. And thank you very much to the audience. And that's all for today. Thank you. We hope to have you here again soon.
I would be honored. I look forward to the next opportunity as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much.